If you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from the frontier. Your support helps us bring these forgotten legends to life. The sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1873. Martha Henley wiped the sweat from her weathered brow as she stirred the massive iron pot hanging over the cook fire behind the Diamond Creek Ranch. At 42, she had been cooking for ranch hands for nearly 2 decades, her calloused hands moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared the evening meal for 30 hungry cowboys. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain across the open range, mixing with the aroma of beans and salt pork that bubbled in her pot. Martha's keen eyes surveyed the horizon, noting the gathering storm clouds that promised relief from the oppressive heat. She had learned to read the sky like a book during her years on the frontier, where survival often depended on anticipating nature's moods. A movement in the scrub brush caught her attention. Something small and quick darted between the thorny bushes about 50 yards from the ranch buildings. Martha squinted against the glare of the late afternoon sun, her hand instinctively moving to the wooden spoon she kept tucked in her apron. Living on the edge of civilization had taught her to be cautious, but her motherly instincts told her this was no threat. The figure emerged slowly from the brush, revealing itself to be a child no more than 8 or 9 years old. The small form moved with the desperate uncertainty of someone who had been running for days. Martha's heart clenched as she recognized the telltale signs of starvation in the child's gaunt frame and hollow cheeks. The youngster's dark hair hung in matted strands around a face marked by exhaustion and fear. Martha set down her stirring spoon and moved carefully toward the child, her movements slow and non-threatening. She could see now that it was a young Native American girl dressed in torn buckskin that had once been decorated with beautiful beadwork. The child's eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope, like a wild animal caught between flight and the desperate need for help. The girl stumbled, her small legs finally giving out after what must have been days of wandering. Martha's maternal instincts overrode any concerns about tribal politics or the complicated relationship between the ranch and the local Native American communities. She rushed forward, catching the child before she could collapse completely onto the hard-packed earth. Up close, Martha could see the full extent of the girl's condition. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her skin was burning with fever, and her small body trembled with weakness. Without hesitation, Martha scooped the child into her arms, feeling how frighteningly light she was. The girl's eyes fluttered closed as she lost consciousness, her head falling against Martha's shoulder. Martha carried the child to her small cabin behind the main ranch house, her mind racing with questions. Where had this girl come from? What had happened to her family? Why was she alone on the vast prairie? But these questions would have to wait. Right now, the most important thing was keeping this child alive. Inside her modest cabin, Martha laid the girl on her own bed, the only soft surface in the simple one-room dwelling. She fetched cool water from her pitcher and began cleaning the dirt and grime from the child's face and hands. The girl's breathing was shallow and labored, and Martha knew she was fighting not just starvation, but exposure and possibly illness. Working quickly, Martha prepared a thin broth from the bones she had been saving for the next day's soup. She knew that someone who had been starving for days couldn't handle solid food immediately without risking serious illness. The broth would provide essential nutrients while being gentle on the child's empty stomach. She added a pinch of salt and some wild herbs she had gathered for their medicinal properties. As the broth simmered, Martha sat beside the bed, studying the girl's face. Even in her weakened state, she could see the child's natural beauty and the strength that had carried her this far. The beadwork on her torn dress suggested she came from a family of skilled craftspeople, and Martha wondered what tragedy had separated this child from her people. When the broth was ready, Martha carefully lifted the girl's head and began spooning small amounts of the warm liquid between her lips. At first, the child didn't respond, but gradually her body's survival instincts kicked in. She began to swallow, and her eyes fluttered open, focusing on Martha's kind face with confusion and wariness. Martha spoke softly, using the few words of Lakota she had learned from friendly traders over the years. Her pronunciation was poor, but the intention was clear. She meant no harm. The girl's eyes widened with surprise at hearing her own language, and some of the fear left her expression. Martha continued feeding her small spoonfuls of broth, pausing frequently to let the child rest. As the evening progressed, the girl's condition began to improve slightly. Her breathing became more regular, and she was able to take larger sips of the broth. Martha never left her side, alternating between feeding her and applying cool cloths to her fevered forehead. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, and rain drummed against the cabin roof, while lightning illuminated the prairie in brief, brilliant flashes. The girl spoke her first words around midnight, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha didn't understand the Lakota words, but she responded with soothing sounds and gentle touches. She had raised 4 children of her own before coming to work at the ranch, and her motherly instincts were as strong as ever. This child needed more than food and medicine. She needed to feel safe and loved. Over the next 3 days, Martha devoted herself entirely to nursing the girl back to health. She prepared simple, nourishing foods and gradually introduced more solid items as the child's strength returned. She learned that the girl's name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her language. Through gestures and the few words they shared, Martha began to piece together fragments of the girl's story. Ayana had been traveling with a small group of her people when they were attacked by soldiers. She had hidden in the brush while her family was killed or captured, and then had wandered alone for days, lost and terrified. The trauma of witnessing such violence had left deep scars on her young mind, and she often woke from nightmares, crying out in her sleep. Martha's heart ached for the child's loss, remembering her own grief when she had lost her husband and children to disease years earlier. She began to share her own story with Ayana, using simple words and gestures to communicate. Despite the language barrier, they developed a deep understanding, united by their shared experiences of loss and survival. As Ayana's physical health improved, Martha noticed the girl's natural intelligence and curiosity. She began teaching her basic English words while learning more Lakota in return. They spent hours together, with Ayana helping Martha with cooking tasks and Martha showing her how to read the weather signs and identify edible plants. The relationship that developed between them transcended cultural boundaries and was built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The ranch hands had initially been suspicious of the Native American child, but Martha's fierce protection and Ayana's gentle nature gradually won them over. The girl had a natural gift for working with animals, and she often helped care for the horses and cattle. Her presence brought a sense of family to the rough bachelor existence of the ranch, and even the most hardened cowboys found themselves smiling at her antics. 3 weeks after Ayana's arrival, everything changed. Martha was hanging laundry behind her cabin when she saw a dust cloud approaching from the east. As the riders drew closer, she recognized the distinctive appearance of a Native American war party. Her heart raced with fear, not for herself, but for Ayana, who was playing nearby with a kitten she had found. The war party consisted of about 15 warriors, their faces painted for battle and their weapons clearly visible. Martha positioned herself between the approaching riders and Ayana, her hands trembling but her resolve firm. She had faced down rustlers and wild animals during her years on the frontier, but this was different. These men were here for the child, and Martha knew she might not be able to protect her. The leader of the war party was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and scars that spoke of many battles. He dismounted about 20 feet from Martha and Ayana, his dark eyes taking in the scene with careful assessment. When he spoke, his voice was deep and commanding, and Martha recognized enough of the Lakota words to understand that he was asking about the child. Ayana had hidden behind Martha at the first sight of the warriors, but when she heard the leader's voice, she peered around Martha's skirts with growing recognition. Suddenly, she cried out a single word and ran toward the man, who caught her in his arms with an expression of profound relief and joy. Martha realized that this was Ayana's grandfather, and that the war party had been searching for her. The reunion was emotional and intense. The old warrior held his granddaughter close, examining her for injuries while speaking rapidly in Lakota. Martha could see tears in his eyes as he assessed Ayana's improved condition and realized how close he had come to losing her forever. The other warriors gathered around, their fierce expressions softening as they welcomed the child back to their group. Then the grandfather's attention turned to Martha. His eyes studied her with the intensity of a man who had spent decades reading the intentions of strangers. Martha stood her ground, meeting his gaze steadily. She knew that this moment would determine not just her fate, but the nature of the relationship between the ranch and the local tribes. Ayana began speaking rapidly to her grandfather, gesturing toward Martha and the cabin. Martha could tell that the child was explaining how she had been cared for, and she saw the old man's expression gradually change from suspicion to something approaching wonder. He looked at Martha with new eyes, seeing not just a white woman, but someone who had shown extraordinary kindness to his granddaughter. The grandfather approached Martha slowly, his weathered hands moving in gestures she didn't recognize. He spoke in Lakota, his voice filled with emotion, and Martha wished desperately that she could understand his words. Ayana translated as best she could, her limited English making the conversation halting but meaningful. The old man was expressing his gratitude for Martha's care and protection of his granddaughter. What happened next would be remembered and spoken of for generations. The grandfather called his warriors to form a circle around Martha and Ayana. He began to speak in ceremonial tones, his voice carrying across the prairie wind. Martha stood still, sensing the gravity of the moment, but not fully understanding its significance. The old warrior drew a knife from his belt, and for a moment Martha tensed, but Ayana squeezed her hand reassuringly. The grandfather cut a lock of his own hair, and then, with great ceremony, cut a small piece from Martha's graying brown hair. He bound the two locks together with sinew and spoke words that seemed to echo with the weight of ancient tradition. Ayana's eyes were wide with amazement as she watched the ceremony. She whispered to Martha that her grandfather was performing a sacred ritual, one that was rarely given to outsiders. Martha was being adopted into their family as a gesture of honor and respect for saving Ayana's life. The ceremony would make her a spiritual sister to the grandfather and a true grandmother to Ayana. The other warriors began to chant, their voices rising and falling in harmonious patterns that seemed to connect with the very earth beneath their feet. Martha felt the power of the moment, understanding that she was witnessing something sacred and rare. The grandfather painted symbols on her forehead with red clay, marking her as a member of their extended family. As the ceremony concluded, the grandfather presented Martha with a beautiful necklace made of turquoise and silver, a family heirloom that signified her new status. He spoke again in Lakota, and Ayana translated that Martha was now under the protection of their tribe and would always be welcome among their people. The gesture was unprecedented, and Martha felt tears streaming down her face as she understood the magnitude of the honor being bestowed upon her. The war party prepared to leave, but not before the grandfather made it clear that Ayana could choose whether to stay with Martha or return with her people. The child looked torn between her love for her grandfather and her growing attachment to the woman who had saved her life. Martha knelt beside Ayana and spoke gently, telling her that she should go with her family where she belonged. But Ayana shook her head firmly. In her mixture of English and Lakota, she explained that Martha was now family too, and that she wanted to stay at the ranch while visiting her grandfather's people regularly. The old warrior considered this arrangement carefully, then nodded his approval. He could see that both Martha and Ayana had found something precious in each other, and he was wise enough not to destroy such a bond. Before departing, the grandfather made a formal agreement with Martha. Ayana would spend the warm months at the ranch, learning the ways of both worlds, and return to her people during the winter months to maintain her connection to her heritage. This arrangement would ensure that the child grew up understanding both cultures while maintaining her identity as a member of the Lakota Nation. The warriors mounted their horses and prepared to leave, but not before each one approached Martha to offer their respect. These were men who had fought against white settlers for years, yet they recognized the extraordinary character of this woman who had risked everything to save a child who was not her own. The grandfather was the last to mount his horse, and he spoke final words to Martha that Ayana translated as a blessing and a promise of protection. As the war party rode away, Martha and Ayana stood together, watching the dust settle on the horizon. The child slipped her small hand into Martha's weathered one, and they walked back toward the cabin together. The other ranch hands had witnessed the entire ceremony from a respectful distance, and they looked at Martha with new admiration and wonder. Word of the adoption ceremony spread quickly throughout the territory. Martha became known as the white woman who had been honored by the Lakota, and her story became legend among both settlers and Native Americans. The ranch became a place of peace and neutral ground, where members of different tribes could come to trade and communicate with the white community. Ayana thrived under this arrangement, growing into a young woman who was equally comfortable in both worlds. She served as a translator and mediator, helping to prevent conflicts and build understanding between the communities. Her presence at the ranch brought a sense of harmony that had been missing from the harsh frontier life. Martha continued to cook for the ranch hands, but her life had been transformed by the experience. She had found a daughter in Ayana and a place of honor among people she had previously known only as strangers. The adoption ceremony had created bonds that would last for generations, and Martha's descendants would be welcomed among the Lakota people for years to come. The necklace given to her by Ayana's grandfather became Martha's most treasured possession. She wore it every day, a visible symbol of the bridge she had built between two worlds through simple acts of kindness and love. The turquoise stones caught the light as she worked, reminding her daily of the sacred trust that had been placed in her care. Years later, when Martha was old and grey, she would sit on her porch and tell the story of how she had found Ayana to anyone who would listen. She would speak of the ceremony with reverence and pride, understanding that she had been part of something much larger than herself. The bond between her and Ayana had not only saved one child's life, but had created a lasting peace between communities that had been at war. The ranch continued to prosper under this new arrangement, with Martha's cooking feeding not just cowboys, but also Native American visitors who came to trade and visit. Her kitchen became a place where cultures mixed and understanding grew, where children of different backgrounds played together and learned from each other. Martha's legacy lived on long after her death, remembered not just as a skilled cook, but as a woman who had shown that love and kindness could transcend any barrier. The adoption ceremony had transformed her from a simple ranch cook into a bridge between worlds, and her story became part of the oral tradition of both the ranching community and the Lakota people. What do you think was the most powerful moment in this story? Was it Martha's initial decision to help a stranger's child, or the incredible honor ceremony that followed? Share your thoughts in the comments below about what true courage